It's a simple question. What happened to two boys, two young princes, Edward and Richard? They went into the Tower of London in 1483, and they were never seen again. Their disappearance is one of history's great mysteries. For more than 500 years, people have argued about it, written books about it, and pointed fingers. The main suspect has always been their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the man who became King Richard III. So did he do it? Did he murder his own nephews to take the throne? It's a story about power, ambition, and betrayal. But the truth is buried deep. There are no confessions. There are no smoking guns. There is only a trail of rumors, propaganda, and circumstantial evidence. To understand what might have happened, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand the world these boys were born into. England in the late 15th century was a dangerous place. The great noble families had been fighting for the crown for decades. This was the Wars of the Roses. The House of Lancaster against the House of York. The prince's father was Edward IV. He was a Yorkist king. He was tall, handsome, and a brilliant soldier. He had seized the throne by force. He had to fight to keep it. His reign was a mix of glamour and brutality. Edward IV did something that shocked the court. He secretly married a woman named Elizabeth Woodville. She was a widow. She was beautiful, but she was not a great European princess. She was a commoner by royal standards. Her family, the Woodvilles, were ambitious. When she became queen, Edward showered her family with titles and wealth. This made the old nobility angry. They saw the Woodvilles as upstarts. This resentment festered. It created deep divisions at court. But as long as Edward IV was alive, he could control it. He was strong enough to keep everyone in line. Edward and Elizabeth had several children. Their eldest son was Edward, born in 1470. He was the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne. Their second son was Richard, Duke of York, born in 1473. These were the two princes. As long as their father lived, their future was secure. Then, in the spring of 1483, everything changed. King Edward IV, still in his prime at just 40 years old, fell ill. It happened fast. Within a few weeks, he was dead. His death created a power vacuum. And in a power vacuum, everyone scrambles for control. His son, Edward V, was now king. But he was only 12 years old. A child king could not rule alone. He needed a protector, a regent to govern the country until he came of age. Before he died, Edward IV had named his most trusted brother to this role. That brother was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was in the north of England when his brother died. He had a reputation as a loyal and capable administrator. He had governed the north well. He was a serious, pious man. He was nothing like his charismatic, pleasure-loving brother. He had served Edward faithfully for years. There was no reason at that moment to think he was anything other than a loyal uncle. The new king, young Edward V, was at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. He was being raised by his mother's family, the Woodvilles. The queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family wanted to control the government. They wanted to hold a quick coronation for the young king. That would end the need for a protector. They would be in charge. They planned to bring Edward to London with a large armed escort. So Richard of Gloucester heard this news. He saw it as a threat. He believed the Woodvilles were trying to shut him out. He believed they were plotting against him. He rode south with his own men. He was joined by another powerful noble, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham also disliked the Woodvilles. They intercepted the young king's party at Stony Stratford. It was a decisive move. Richard arrested the king's Woodville relatives who were with him, including his uncle, Earl Rivers. He told his nephew, the young king, that they had been plotting against him. He assured the boy he was there to protect him. He took control of the king. When Queen Elizabeth Woodville heard what had happened, she panicked. She knew her family had lost control. She fled with her younger son Richard and her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. The sanctuary was a place protected by the church. No one could be arrested there. She was afraid for her life. Richard of Gloucester brought his nephew, the new King Edward V, to London. He presented him as the rightful king. He began making arrangements for the coronation. The boy was lodged in the Tower of London. This was not unusual. The Tower was a royal palace as well as a prison. It was traditional for monarchs to stay there before their coronation. At first, no one thought it was sinister. The young king was seen playing in the gardens. He was treated like a king. But Richard was consolidating his power. He had his Woodville rivals executed. He declared himself Lord Protector. He controlled the government. He controlled the king. But there was a problem. As long as the Woodvilles had the other prince, the younger brother Richard, they had a potential figurehead. And Richard needed the boy. He claimed he was needed for the coronation. He sent the Archbishop of Canterbury to Westminster Abbey to persuade the Queen to release her younger son. The Queen resisted. She did not trust Richard, but she was surrounded. She had little choice. She finally handed over her 9-year-old son. The little boy was taken to join his brother in the Tower. Now Richard had them both. The two heirs to the throne were under his lock and key. This was the moment the trap closed. With both princes secured, things started to move quickly. Richard's allies began to spread a shocking story. A priest named Ralph Shaw preached a sermon at St. Paul's Cross. He claimed that the late King Edward IV had been contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he married Elizabeth Woodville. If this was true, his marriage to Elizabeth was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, all of their children were illegitimate. They had no claim to the throne. This was a bombshell. It meant the two princes in the tower were not princes at all. They were bastards. And if they were bastards, who was the rightful king? The next in line was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Parliament was convened. They were presented with this story in a document called the Titulus Regius, the title of the king. The document laid out the legal case for Richard's claim. Parliament accepted it. They declared the princes illegitimate and offered the crown to Richard. After a show of reluctance, he accepted. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. And what about the boys in the tower? After their uncle became king, they were seen less and less. An Italian visitor to London, Dominic Mancini, was there during these months. He wrote an account of what he saw and heard. He said that after Richard III took the throne, the boys were moved to the inner apartments of the tower. They were seen looking out of the windows. Then they vanished. Mancini wrote that the young king was like a victim prepared for sacrifice. He said he heard that the boy believed he was going to be killed. By the late summer of 1483, rumors began to circulate. The princes were dead. They had been murdered. People whispered that their uncle, the king, had ordered it. The rumors were strong enough to fuel a rebellion against Richard later that year. The rebels, who had initially planned to rescue the boys and put Edward V back on the throne, changed their plans. They now backed a new claimant, a distant Lancastrian heir named Henry Tudor. Why would they do that if they thought the princes were still alive? It suggests that even then, people believed the boys were gone. So, the case against Richard III seems strong. Let's look at it like a prosecutor would. First, motive. Richard had the strongest motive of anyone. As long as his nephews were alive, they were a threat. Even if they were declared illegitimate, people could change their minds. A future parliament could reverse the decision. Rebellions could be raised in their name. They were the sons of a popular king. They represented a living, breathing challenge to Richard's rule. Killing them would remove that threat permanently. Second, opportunity. He had total control over the princes. They were in his fortress, guarded by his men, and he could control who saw them. He could control what happened to them. No one else could get to them. Third, the circumstantial evidence. The boys disappeared while in his care. He never produced them to quell the rumors of their death. If they were alive, why not show them to the world? He could have paraded them through the streets of London and instantly silenced his critics. He could have proved the rumors were lies, but he didn't. He never mentioned them in public again. His silence is damning. Then there is the historical narrative that formed after his death. After Richard III was defeated and killed by Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the Tudor dynasty began. Tudor historians had every reason to paint Richard as a monster. It justified Henry Tudor's seizure of the throne. The most famous account comes from Sir Thomas More, who wrote his history of King Richard III about 30 years later. More's version of the story is vivid and detailed. He names the killer. He says Richard ordered a man named Sir James Tyrrell to go to the tower and kill the princes. Tyrrell, in turn, got two henchmen, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, to do the deed. According to More, they went into the prince's chamber late at night and smothered them with their pillows. Then they buried the bodies at the foot of a staircase. More's account became the definitive story. It's the version William Shakespeare used for his play Richard III, which cemented the image of Richard as a hunchbacked, power-hungry villain for centuries. But is More's account reliable? He was only a small boy when the events happened. He was writing decades later under a Tudor king. His sources were likely people who had a grudge against Richard. His story is filled with dramatic speeches that he couldn't possibly have known were said. It reads more like a moral play than a factual history. So, while it tells us what people under the Tudors believed, it's not proof. It's Tudor propaganda. But propaganda is often most effective when it is built on a kernel of truth. The rumors of the prince's murder started during Richard's reign, not after. The Tudors amplified the story, they didn't invent it from nothing. So the case against Richard is powerful. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. His own actions, or lack thereof, make him look guilty. But this is a 500-year-old cold case. We have to look at the other side. We have to consider the defense. People who defend Richard, often called Ricardians, have a different view. They argue that Richard was a loyal man who was forced into a difficult position. They say he was protecting the kingdom from chaos and a civil war that would have been orchestrated by the greedy Woodville family. He took the throne legally through an act of parliament, the Titulus Regius. He didn't need to kill the boys. Declaring them illegitimate was enough. They also point to Richard's character. Before 1483, he was known as an honorable and just man. Could such a man really murder his own brother's children? They argue it was completely out of character. They suggest that the story of his villainy was created by his enemies to destroy his reputation. And they raise a crucial point: there is no real proof, not a single piece of direct evidence. No eyewitness account from the time. No document, nothing. Just rumors and the stories written by his enemies after he was dead. In a modern court of law, you couldn't convict him. The case is entirely circumstantial. If Richard didn't do it, then who did? This leads to other suspects. There are a few possibilities. One is the Duke of Buckingham. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was Richard's right-hand man. He was instrumental in helping Richard take the throne. He was richly rewarded for it. But just a few months into Richard's reign, Buckingham led a massive rebellion against him. Why the sudden change of heart? The reason has always been a puzzle. One theory is that Buckingham killed the princes himself. Perhaps he did it on his own initiative, thinking it would please Richard. But Richard, a genuinely pious man, was horrified by the act. This caused a rift between them, leading Buckingham to rebel. Another version of this theory is that Buckingham killed them to frame Richard, hoping to seize the throne for himself. He had a distant royal claim of his own. This theory is intriguing, but it has a major problem. Buckingham did not have control of the Tower of London. It's hard to see how he could have ordered the murder of the princes without the king's knowledge or consent. When Richard was in charge, the constable of the Tower answered to him. This brings us to the most credible alternative suspect, Henry Tudor, the man who became King Henry VII. Let's look at his motive. When Henry Tudor landed in England in 1485 to challenge Richard, his claim to the throne was incredibly weak. He was descended from a legitimized but barred line. If the princes were still alive after he defeated Richard at Bosworth, they would have been a massive problem for him. Their claim to the throne, even if they were officially bastards, was far stronger in the eyes of the people than his. If the princes were alive in the Tower when Henry took over, what would he have done with them? He couldn't let them go. They would have become figureheads for rebellion. So, the argument goes, Henry had an even stronger motive to kill them than Richard did. He needed them out of the way to secure his new dynasty. The timing is key here. The princes disappeared in the summer of 1483. Henry Tudor didn't take the throne until August 1485. So for Henry to be the killer, the princes must have survived for 2 years in the Tower under Richard's watch. Ricardians argue this is possible. Richard might have kept them alive, but hidden. Then, when Henry took over, he quietly had them disposed of. The behavior of Henry VII is also suspicious. Like Richard, he never produced the boys. After he became king, you would think he would launch a massive investigation into their disappearance. He could have put James Tyrrell on trial. He could have found the bodies and given them a royal burial. This would have been the ultimate propaganda victory. It would have proven Richard's guilt beyond all doubt and cemented his own right to rule. But he did none of these things. He said almost nothing about it. Years later, a man named Perkin Warbeck appeared, claiming to be the younger prince, Richard, Duke of York. He gained significant support across Europe. He was a serious threat to Henry VII for years. If Henry knew for a fact that the princes were dead and knew how they died, he could have easily discredited Warbeck. But he seemed to struggle to do so. Could this be because he didn't know for sure what had happened? Or was it because he was hiding his own guilt? The case against Henry is compelling, but it also has weaknesses. The overwhelming consensus from the contemporary sources is that the princes were killed in 1483 when Richard III was king. The rumors started then, the rebellions started then. For Henry to be the murderer, you have to believe that everyone at the time was wrong. You have to believe that the princes were kept alive and hidden for 2 years, which seems unlikely. It is far simpler to believe they were killed shortly after they disappeared from public view, and the person in power at that time was Richard. This brings us to the physical evidence, or lack of it. For centuries, there were only stories. But in 1674, something happened. Workers at the Tower of London were demolishing a staircase, and under it they found a wooden chest. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. Everyone assumed this was them. It seemed to confirm Thomas More's story about them being buried at the foot of a staircase. King Charles II, believing them to be the long-lost princes, had their bones placed in an urn and interred with honor in Westminster Abbey. and there they lay for another 250 years. In 1933, the urn was opened. The bones were examined by an anatomist. He concluded that the skeletons were of two children, whose ages matched those of the princes. He also noted some evidence that suggested a familial relationship. For many, this was case closed. The bodies had been found. Richard was guilty, but modern science has cast doubt on the 1933 examination. The methods used were of their time. The anatomist could not definitively determine the sex of the skeletons. He could not determine the cause of death. He certainly couldn't do DNA testing. And the bones could have belonged to any two children buried in the tower over its long history. Today, there is a campaign to have the bones re-examined. With modern DNA and forensic analysis, scientists could potentially determine the sex, the age at death, and even the cause of death. They could extract DNA and compare it to a known living descendant of the family. This could finally prove if the bones in the urn are in fact the princes. It might not tell us who killed them, but it would be a huge piece of the puzzle. But so far, the royal family and the Church of England have refused to grant permission for an examination. The princes remain undisturbed in their tomb. So where does that leave us? We are left with a 500-year-old mystery with no definitive answer. We are forced to weigh the probabilities. The traditional story, the one from Moore and Shakespeare, is almost certainly a biased, exaggerated piece of political assassination. Richard III was probably not the cackling, monstrous villain he was made out to be. He was a man of his time, a time that was violent and ruthless. But was he a murderer? The evidence against him, though circumstantial, remains the strongest. He had the motive. He had the opportunity. The boys disappeared on his watch. He failed to prove they were alive. The simplest explanation, the one that requires the fewest assumptions, is that he had them killed. It was a brutal act, but perhaps, in his mind, a necessary one to secure his throne and prevent another civil war. He may have seen it as the lesser of two evils. The other theories, particularly the one about Henry Tudor, are plausible. They are important because they show that Richard's guilt is not a certainty. There is room for reasonable doubt, but these theories require us to believe in a more complicated sequence of events. They require us to believe that the contemporary rumors were all wrong. Ultimately, we cannot know for sure. The trail went cold centuries ago. All the people who knew the truth are long dead. They took their secrets with them. Perhaps Richard was a ruthless killer who murdered his own blood. Perhaps he was an innocent man framed by his enemies. Perhaps the truth is something more complex, something we can't even imagine. The story endures not because we know the answer, but because we don't. It's a human drama about family, loyalty, and the corrupting nature of power. We see a loyal brother, a grieving mother, a child king, and an ambitious uncle. We see the raw, brutal politics of a medieval court, and at the heart of it all, we see two children, Edward and Richard. They walked into a stone fortress and into the pages of history, and then they were gone. The silence they left behind has echoed for half a millennium, and we are still listening, still asking, what happened to the princes in the tower?